Yo guys, hello, and welcome back to my channel. So, Trump's tariffs are expected to save $4 trillion over the next 10 years. Yeah, you heard that right. A recent report from the Congressional Budget Office says that over the next decade, tariffs could reduce the U.S. budget deficit by a massive $4 trillion. So let's break this down, everything in simple words. What exactly did the CBO report say? What are the conditions? What's the current situation? And most importantly, is this goal actually achievable? Let's dive in. Well, right now, as you probably know, the U.S. has basically become the tariff king. President Trump has slapped tariffs of around 15 to 16% on pretty much every country. Countries like Brazil and India have even faced tariffs as high as 50%. And honestly, it looks like these tariffs might go even higher in the future. Now, because of these tariffs, or you could say the taxes that other countries are paying just to sell their goods in the U.S. government is raking in a ton of cash. For example, if we just talk about July, the U.S. collected about $28 billion in extra revenue just from tariffs. To put that into perspective, that's the most money the U.S. government has ever collected from tariffs in a single month. So yeah, that's a huge win for the U.S., at least in terms of revenue. But here's the problem. On one hand, tariffs are boosting the U.S. government's income, but on the other hand, the U.S. deficit is still growing. In simple terms, a deficit means the government is spending more money than it's bringing in from taxes and other income sources. And when that happens, the government has to borrow money, which adds to the national debt. For example, in July alone, even though tariff revenue was super high, the U.S. deficit still grew to $291 billion. So yeah, while tariffs are bringing in big bucks, they're not completely solving the deficit problem, at least not yet. And as of 2025, the U.S. federal deficit is projected to be somewhere around $1.5 to $2 trillion. To put that into perspective, that's roughly around 7% of a U.S. GDP. The U.S. government is borrowing money at a staggering pace. But now, as tariffs have started to show their impact, the CBO director, Philip Swagel, made a bold claim. He said that the tariffs could reduce the U.S. deficit by $4 trillion over the next 10 years. That's actually a big jump from their earlier forecast of $3 trillion back in June. Now here, I want to show you a quick clip of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, where he talks about the impact of tariffs on the U.S. economy.
President Trump and I are laser focused on paying down the debt. So I've been saying that tariff revenue could be $300 billion this year. I'm going to have to revise that up substantially. So I think that we're going to bring down the deficit to GDP. We'll start paying down debt. And then at a point that can be used as an offset to the American people.
So yeah, even Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is really positive about this tariff revenue. And honestly, it's a huge leap compared to last year. Now, according to the CBO, tariffs are projected to reduce primary deficits by about $3.3 trillion over the next decade. And since tariffs bring in more money, the U.S. government won't need to borrow as much to cover its expenses. Less borrowing means the U.S. government will have to pay less interest on the national debt, saving an estimated $700 billion in interest payments over the next 10 years. So that's a total of $4 trillion in deficit reduction. Now, let me break this down for you in the simplest way possible. This will help you really understand how it all works. Let's say the U.S. government earns $4.5 trillion every year through taxes and other sources, but it spends $5 trillion. So obviously, every year there's a $0.5 trillion deficit. This is called the primary deficit. And how does the U.S. government cover that deficit? Simple, it borrows money. So over 10 years, the U.S. government would end up borrowing $5 trillion. Now, don't forget, borrowed money comes with interest. Let's say that interest adds another $1 trillion over the decade. So the total debt burden becomes $5 trillion loan plus $1 trillion interest, which equals $6 trillion. Now imagine the U.S. government says, okay, if you want to import goods from China or other countries, you got to pay tariffs. Let's say these tariffs bring in about $330 billion per year. which in trillion equals $0.33 trillion. Now the U.S. government's income becomes $4.5 trillion plus $0.33 trillion, which equals $4.83 trillion. So what happens to the deficit? It shrinks. $5 trillion to $4.83 trillion equals just $0.17 trillion per year. Now, the U.S. government doesn't need to borrow as much anymore. Over 10 years, instead of borrowing $5 trillion, it only needs to borrow about $1.7 trillion. And since it's borrowing way less, it's also paying less in interest. Instead of paying $1 trillion in interest, maybe it only pays around $0.3 trillion. So in simple, tariffs help reduce the primary deficit by about $3.3 trillion, and the U.S. government saves another $700 billion in interest payments. That's a total savings of $4 trillion. That's why the CBO is now saying these new tariffs could lead to a $4 trillion reduction in the U.S. budget deficit over the next decade. Pretty massive, right? But now, the big question is, are these tariffs sustainable in the long run? And will they really reduce the federal deficit by $4 trillion over the next decade? As of August 2025, the average tariff rate is around 16.7%. And the Budget Office has made it clear, if this rate stays the same and no major legal or trade hurdles get in the way, then the U.S. could indeed reduce its deficit by up to $4 trillion over the next 10 years. But we're already seeing that U.S. courts are divided on these tariff issues. If, in the future, the U.S. Supreme Court declares many of these tariffs illegal, the projected savings could drop from $4 trillion to just $1 trillion. So, this whole plan is completely dependent on what the U.S. courts decide. Even CBO Director Philip Swagel admitted that tariffs come with their own trade-offs. They make imported goods more expensive. They could shrink the overall size of the U.S. economy. Productivity and investment may take a hit. And, of course, inflation could rise. So yeah, the U.S. government is bringing in more money now, but it might hurt the economy in the long run. Not ideal. Meanwhile, there's also the big, beautiful bill that's passed. So the tax cut and spending bills are expected to increase the deficit by $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years. So a lot of the extra money from tariffs, it's already getting canceled out by these new policies. Now imagine if tariffs get repealed in the future, whether because of U.S. court rulings or trade negotiations. That revenue stream? Gone. The U.S. government's income drops, and then the deficit starts climbing again. Unless there's a solid replacement for that lost income, the U.S. government's going to be in trouble. Oh, and don't forget, if the U.S. Congress doesn't pass new spending bills by the end of September, there's a risk of a government shutdown, which means even more economic uncertainty. Then there's the issue of global trade relations. A lot of the U.S.'s trade partners, especially India, China, Brazil, are not happy about these tariffs and have retaliated with their own. Over time, this could escalate, creating a worse global trade environment, which is bad for everyone. Whether these tariffs survive or not really depends on international relations, court decisions, and future trade deals. So there's no guarantee that tariffs will keep generating money for 10 years straight. So what's the conclusion here? Well, for now, President Trump's tariffs are a big income source for the U.S. government. And yes, if they remain in place, they could reduce the deficit by up to $4 trillion over the next decade. But whether they'll actually achieve that goal depends on a lot of factors, like global trade relations, domestic politics, and the overall health of the U.S. economy. So, what do you think about this development? Comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.